Hi everyone, welcome back to Plant Boy. My name is Cade, and today we are going to be talking about variegation. Just kind of everything you need to know, a kind of brief overview of variegation, how to maintain it, the different types, how to care for it, so on and so forth. So before we jump in, I would like you to like the video if you enjoy it and enjoy the content, and consider commenting and subscribing. It really does help the channel. Now, let's start off by talking about the definition of variegation. According to Merriam-Webster, it's exhibiting different colors, especially as irregular patches or streaks. So really, there are so many different types of variegated plants because variegated, especially in the horticultural or houseplant community, is a very broad kind of umbrella term. All of the plants that I have sitting in front of me, as well as the majority of the ones behind me, are considered variegated plants. So that brings me to the next point that you should know. There are primarily 3 to 4 different types of variegation that we'll talk about. Most common, you are going to see 3 types in the houseplant community. So starting with something that you may not think is variegation, we actually have something called blistered variegation. This is whenever there are layers of cellular material and there are actually tiny air pockets on a cellular level that reflect light back whenever light strikes it. And good examples of this are going to be like the Scindapsus pictus or the Scindapsus exotica. It actually has like this silvery sheen to it whenever the light hits it. And certain alocasias and anthuriums also have this kind of reflective pattern or streaks on their veins. It's kind of silvery if you look at it really up close, and it has a sheen to it. This is actually considered a form of variegation that most commonly we don't really think of as variegation, as we've been conditioned to think that variegation is a white monstera. The next plant that you may not actually consider to be variegated but are going to be pattern gene variegations. These are going to be cultivars that have been bred over the years to be a certain way. And examples of this would be different Sansevieria or different snake plants. Like the golden honey here, you see that it has these streaks of color, and this is a cultivar that has been bred to appear this way. This is a stable variegation, meaning that this plant is not going to turn one way or the other as far as I'm aware. Another good example of this are going to be calatheas and marantas as well. So this is the peacock plant that I have here in front of me, and this plant will never turn consistently light green or consistently dark green. It will always have this kind of patterning and this kind of banding on its leaf, and that is because it is a genetically stable cultivar of variegation in a houseplant. So the plants that were just mentioned, such as the alocasia with the blistering variegation and the calatheas or the marantas with the pattern gene variegation, really don't require any kind of special care in order to maintain their variegation because they are stable and they are bred to be that way. However, there is a third type of variegation that is most often thought to be variegation whenever we hear it, and that is known as chimeral variegation. And this is actually a genetic mutation within the plant that is unstable, meaning that this plant can turn all white, it can turn all green, or somewhere in between, and it is our responsibility as the plant parent to maintain that variegation through proper care. A great example of this would be the ever elusive variegated monstera, which I will picture here. This is a variegated Hoya carnosa compacta, or the variegated Hindu rope. This is less pronounced, it just has some white banding across the edge of its leaf. And the marble queen pothos here is another good example. So these chimeral plants all do have one thing in common, and that it is a genetic mutation that is unstable. So all of these plants that I just mentioned on this side can revert. And certain other plants like the pink princess philodendron, if you've ever shopped for that online, you may see ones that are reverted, meaning that it has lost that genetic mutation of that variegation. Some people buy it and baby it in hopes of that genetic mutation returning if maybe it's not very pronounced and it was just missed, but it's very unlikely. So as we can see here, this marble queen, and if you have a marble queen, you may notice maybe these white leaves begin to turn like a kind of mint green, and then they turn green over a period of time. So as I mentioned, it is our responsibility to maintain this variegation. You should know that this white foliage happens because of a genetic mutation that causes a lack of chlorophyll in the plant. And chlorophyll is an organelle on the cellular level of this plant that actually photosynthesizes sunlight and turns it into energy for the plant. So what that means is that white leaves are not going to be able to produce nearly as much energy as a solid green leaf because of that lack of that photosynthesizing organelle. So plants that are heavily variegated and have a lot of these white portions to it require a much higher amount of light because they don't have nearly as many resources on the cellular level to produce as much energy. You're also going to notice, specifically with things like the marble queen pothos, that this plant will revert if it is not getting enough sunlight. And that is true of all of these chimerally variegated houseplants. So these are going to require substantially more light, in my experience, than their non-variegated counterparts. You should also know that genetic mutations aren't passed along through seeds or anything like that, whereas like a pattern gene variegation is. So if you buy a calathea seed online, you're going to get the calathea seed, granted that's what they gave you. But if you buy a variegated monstera seed online, you're not going to get a variegated monstera. If you're lucky, they will give you monstera seeds, but more likely than not, it's just a scam. So don't spend your money on variegated seeds because it's literally impossible. These chimeral plants, because they cannot be done through seed, have to be propagated. And that is probably one of the reasons for their appeal. They're harder to get your hands on because they have to be propagated or tissue cultured, and they are much harder to propagate as well because of that lack of chlorophyll. It definitely kind of impacts the success of the plant if you're working with limited light resource. So besides more light, how else are you going to maintain the variegation on this plant? Obviously, you want to give it a lot of light, and if you see all green leaves coming out or things like that, you definitely want to trim this back. I have been propagating this and just making like a jade pothos from it, so you can just propagate it like that and just create a separate plant. A dead giveaway for how your leaves are going to look is going to be the variegation on the stem. So if you do look at your stems and you notice that they are all green or even all white, you want to take care of that as soon as possible. While all white parts of a variegated plant may seem very appealing, like I said, these are not going to have any chlorophyll in them at all, which means it's actually just a liability for the plant to keep alive, and sooner rather than later, the plant is going to decide to pull its energy away from that all white leaf because there's no purpose in keeping it alive any longer. So that's another thing that you should know. If you are purchasing a variegated plant online, steer clear of all white plants because they're not going to live, and the likelihood of you getting a leaf that does have any green in it to salvage the plant as a whole is very unlikely. Whenever you're purchasing these plants, you definitely want to make sure that you are looking at the stem of the plant to make sure that you have a good amount and a good mix of white banding to green banding, or whatever colors your variegated plant has, whether it be white, green, yellow, cream, whatever. But I think that just about covers the kind of overview of variegation, whether it be genetic mutation or bred through cultivars or little pockets of air within the leaf that cause a kind of silver sheen whenever light hits marketed as variegated plants versus, these we don't typically think of variegated. So like I said, make sure you do your research before you buy high ticket variegated plants. Make sure that there is a good blend between white and green. Don't buy seeds, you're not gonna get what you want. And make sure you give it plenty of light and also maintain that variegation through proper pruning. If you see an all green or all white or something that is majority white or majority green, you might want to consider pruning it because the likelihood of it balancing out in the future is relatively low. And these plants, the chimeral variegated plants, can revert back because it is a genetic mutation. So it takes due diligence as a variegated houseplant owner to make sure you are maintaining these plants properly in order to get the plant that you want. But I hope that kind of answered some different questions for you all on variegation, how to care for it, different types, how to maintain it, so on and so forth. Let me know if you have any questions down below, or if you have found any tips or tricks on how to care for variegated plants or anything like that. Just let me know down in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.